The year is 452. The air in Rome is thick, not with the scent of incense, but with the metallic tang of fear. The Western Roman Empire is a ghost, a fading memory, whose heart no longer beats in this city. The emperor, a distant and impotent figure, hides in the marshes of Ravenna. Legions, the pride of generations, are scattered, broken, or non-existent. For decades, the world has been coming apart at the seams. The eternal city itself bears the fresh scars of the Visigothic sack of 410, a psychological wound from which it has never recovered. Now, a new terror approaches from the north, a name that is not spoken but whispered, a force described not as an army but as a scourge of God, Attila the Hun. His path through northern Italy is a trail of fire, ash, and lamentation. He stands at the river Mincio, poised to descend upon the vulnerable, symbolic heart of a fallen civilization. There is no army to meet him, no emperor to negotiate. There is only a void. And into that void steps a man armed with nothing but a crucifix, a staff, and an idea. He is the Bishop of Rome, Leo I. We see him, an aging figure in clerical robes, leading a small delegation of senators out from the city gates, moving towards the most feared warlord on earth. Pope Leo I meets Attila. This is not a battle of swords, but of symbols. On one side, the raw, kinetic power of conquest that has leveled kingdoms. On the other, a nascent spiritual authority, built on a claim to be the heir of a Galilean fisherman. The historical accounts of what happened next are shrouded in legend. Later Christian tradition, captured in a famous fresco by Raphael, would paint a miraculous scene. The apostles Peter and Paul appearing in the sky with swords of fire, terrifying the Hun into retreat. The reality was likely far more terrestrial, involving a hefty payment of Roman gold and Attila's own strategic concerns about overextending his supply lines and the risk of disease. But the outcome for the people of Rome was the same. Attila turned back, and Leo returned not just as a bishop, but as the defender of the city. This moment was a profound turning point. It was the crystallization of a process that had been slowly unfolding for over a century. The papacy's claim to leadership wasn't invented by Leo. It was rooted in theology, specifically the Petran doctrine, based on the words of Jesus to the Apostle Peter in the Gospel of Matthew. "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." As Peter was believed to have been martyred in Rome, his successors, the bishops of Rome, argued they inherited his unique authority. For centuries, this was primarily a matter of ecclesiastical debate, a claim of spiritual primacy over other powerful bishops in Alexandria, Antioch, or Constantinople. But with the political collapse of the West, this theological claim suddenly had a practical, worldly stage on which to act. The Roman aristocracy, the senators and administrators who remained, saw in the Bishop of Rome the only figure with the moral authority, the organizational structure, and the international network to provide stability in a world of chaos. The Church was the only institution left standing that still functioned across the ruins of the old provinces. Critics, both then and now, would point to this moment as the genesis of a dangerous fusion. They see a spiritual leader stepping into the role of a politician, a Caesar in cleric's robes, trading the humility of the gospel for the intoxicating allure of temporal power. They argue that the Church, in saving the city, began a long, slow process of losing its soul, becoming entangled in the very worldly ambitions it was meant to transcend. Yet, for millions of adherents, this was a sign of divine providence. They saw a shepherd protecting his flock when their secular rulers had abandoned them. In their eyes, Leo was not seizing power, but courageously shouldering a burden, demonstrating that the Church was not an ethereal, otherworldly concept, but a living, breathing force for justice and order in a broken world. The power vacuum left by the Caesars was not just political, it was administrative, judicial, and social. And the Bishop of Rome, with the growing machinery of the Church, was the only one capable of filling it. This single dramatic confrontation on the plains of Italy cemented a new reality. Where the emperor had failed, the Pope had succeeded. The mantle of Rome's authority was not destroyed. It was being transferred. How did this spiritual office, in one of history's most audacious transformations, come to not only wield such worldly power, but to model its entire structure on the very empire it was now replacing? Building on that profound shift in papal authority from spiritual guide to civic defender, we now trace the tangible echoes of Rome's administrative genius within the very bones of the nascent papacy. We move forward in time, away from the dramatic confrontation with the Huns and into the quiet, methodical world of a Vatican scriptorium in the 7th century. Imagine a scribe, his face illuminated by a single candle, leaning over a sheet of vellum. He is not composing a homily on love and forgiveness. He is drafting a papal decree, an official judgment on a land dispute in a distant English monastery. The language is Latin, but it is not the lyrical Latin of Virgil. It is the precise, technical, legalistic Latin of the Roman Senate. Ancient papal decree. Every phrase, every clause is constructed for maximum authority and minimum ambiguity. This document is not a suggestion, it is a ruling. It is an act of governance, echoing the chancellery of a Roman emperor. This was not a coincidence. It was a conscious and strategic adoption of the most effective organizational blueprint the world had ever known. As the Church expanded from a persecuted sect into a dominant religion, it faced immense logistical challenges. How do you manage a faith that spans from the deserts of Syria to the forests of Gaul? How do you ensure doctrinal consistency, resolve disputes, and manage vast resources? The answer was right there, in the ruins of the imperial system. The church hierarchy began to mirror the Roman civil administration with breathtaking fidelity. The Roman territorial unit, known as a dema, governed by an imperial vicar, became the ecclesiastical diocese, governed by a bishop. The larger Roman colia became the church's metropolitan provinces, overseen by an archbishop. The very map of ecclesiastical power was drawn directly over the fading map of imperial control. The church, in essence, slipped on the still warm clothes of the deceased empire. This inheritance went far beyond geography. It permeated the very culture of governance. The Roman genius for law, codified in massive works like the Justinian and later the Prudence, became the model for the church's own canon law. The church developed a complex legal system to govern itself, complete with courts, lawyers, and precedents, all structured on Roman principles of jurisprudence. This provided a stable, predictable framework for a chaotic world, but it also meant that faith was increasingly articulated through the language of law, rights, and obligations. Perhaps the most potent symbol of this transfer of power was the adoption of the title Pontifex. This had been the title of the chief priest of the ancient Roman state religion, a pagan office later absorbed by the emperors themselves to signify their supreme religious authority over the empire. After the emperors became Christian, the title fell into disuse, only to be revived and adopted by the Bishop of Rome. It was a stunning statement. The ultimate authority that once belonged to Caesar now belonged to the Pope. The great historian of the medieval papacy, Walter Allman, argued that this process created what he called a hierarchic system, a form of government where the spiritual authority claimed supreme power over the secular rulers as well. For Allman, this wasn't just a practical adaptation, it was a deliberate theological and political strategy to create a new kind of universal empire, a Christian commonwealth governed from Rome. This perspective, however, is not without its critics. Other historians argue the process was more organic, a matter of practical necessity rather than a grand preconceived plan. They suggest the church simply used the best tools available to it in order to survive and minister to its flock. From the perspective of the Eastern Orthodox churches, which continued to exist within the living Roman Empire in Constantinople, this Romanization of the Western Church was a grave error. They saw the Bishop of Rome's increasing centralization and his claims of universal jurisdiction as a monarchical power grab, a departure from the ancient Christian tradition of collegial governance by councils of bishops. They saw a patriarch becoming an emperor. This raises a fundamental and unsettling question. What happens when a faith founded on the message of a humble carpenter from Nazareth, a man who said his kingdom was not of this world, inherits the full administrative and legal machinery of the world's greatest empire? Did this imperial structure provide the necessary vessel to carry the Christian message through the centuries, a strong framework that prevented it from fracturing into 1,000 pieces? Or did the vessel inevitably alter the substance within it, diluting a spiritual mission with the worldly imperatives of power, bureaucracy, and control? If the Church had now adopted Rome's administrative, did it also inevitably inherit its political? Exploring this blend of spiritual mission and imperial machinery, we arrive at the profound consequences of this ancient blueprint, a legacy that continues to fuel fiery debates and shape the Catholic Church today. The scene is no longer ancient, it is now. We are standing in St. Peter's Square, a vast space designed to project power and embrace the faithful. But today, the crowd is not here for a papal blessing. They are protesters. Their banners, written in a dozen languages, carry messages of dissent, calls for financial transparency from the Vatican Bank, demands for a greater role for the laity, cries for the ordination of women, and pleas for a more decentralized, less monarchical church. Modern Vatican protest. This tension, this clash between a powerful, centralized authority and the call for local autonomy and reform is a direct, living inheritance of the papacy's decision to model itself on the Roman Empire. This struggle is woven into the very fabric of Western history. The medieval papacy, armed with its Roman-style legal and administrative power, claimed authority over kings and emperors. Documents like the infamous Donation of Constantine, a forged Roman imperial decree that supposedly granted the Pope vast temporal power, were used for centuries to justify the existence of the Papal States and the Pope's role as a worldly sovereign. This led to epic clashes like the investiture controversy, a titanic struggle between popes and emperors over who had the ultimate authority to appoint bishops. It was a conflict rooted in the question of whether the Church was a spiritual body or a political one with a Roman-style claim to universal jurisdiction. The Protestant Reformation in the 16th century was, at its core, a radical rejection of this entire imperial model. Martin Luther and other reformers attacked the papacy not just on theological grounds, but for being a vast, legalistic, and power-hungry institution that had lost touch with the simple gospel. Even in the modern era, the Church continues to grapple with this ghost of empire. The Second Vatican Council in the 1960s was, in many ways, a monumental debate about this very legacy. A key conflict at the Council was between the principle of papal primacy, the idea of the Pope's supreme monarchical authority, a direct heir to the Roman, and the concept of episcopal collegiality, which holds that the bishops, as a collective body, share in the responsibility for governing the Church. It was a battle between the centralized imperial model and a more decentralized apostolic one. The Council ultimately affirmed both principles, leaving a creative but unresolved tension that continues to define internal Church politics to this day. Pope Francis's own emphasis on synodality, a process of walking and listening together, is seen by many as a direct attempt to finally move the Church away from its top-down imperial mode of operating. Contemporary critics, like the historian Gary Wills in his provocative book Papal Sin, argue forcefully that this Roman inheritance is the source of many of the Church's modern crises. He contends that the imperial emphasis on secrecy, unquestioning obedience, and a rigid hierarchical structure, all hallmarks of Roman bureaucracy, created a culture that enabled the catastrophic handling of the clerical abuse scandal. From this perspective, the institutional machinery designed for imperial governance is fundamentally at odds with a pastoral mission that requires transparency, accountability, and humility. However, this is not the only interpretation. Other theologians, like the influential Cardinal Avery Dulles, have argued that it is precisely this strong, centralized institutional structure, the Church as institution model, that has allowed Catholicism to maintain its doctrinal unity and global cohesion for 2 millennia. In a world of constant change and cultural fragmentation, they argue this Roman-inspired stability is not a liability, but a unique strength, a rock of certainty in a turbulent sea. The question, then, is not whether the Roman Empire's ghost haunts the halls of the Vatican. The evidence is overwhelming that it does. The true question is whether that ghost is a destructive poltergeist or a guardian spirit. Can the papacy, the oldest continuing absolute monarchy in the world, truly reform itself and separate its spiritual mandate from the powerful ancient blueprint of empire? Or is this remarkable, paradoxical fusion of the fisherman's cross and the emperor's eagle its unique, indelible, and perhaps necessary identity in a constantly changing world?